The Giant Killers by Conway Fitzgerald. Chapter 8.
I had seen the miracles they could deliver with my own eyes. I had observed the fear and faith they could inspire among the masses. Yet despite bearing personal witness to the invisible power these priests held over life and death, the only belief I had in the gods was that they had nothing but contempt for me. I had, for very good reason, rejected my own people and my own gods. Now I had in turn been rejected by all those I'd come to love. Theb was gone, and now Dan was gone too. I truly did walk alone for the very first time. Fergus' command to go find my people defied logic. I was a creation of two races, but without any one to claim as my own. I was an alien to all. I hiked briskly through the strangely quiet borderlands, trying to digest Fergus' heavenly commandment. I needed the exercise. My spine was filled with a strange, anxious energy I had never felt before. I was compelled to move quickly, but without a clear destination in mind. I did have a constant suspicion of being watched, but it had occurred to me that if I was anyone's mark, I'd probably be dead by now. I walked until I was too tired and then rested in the arms of a tree, high above a rocky ridge. My legs and feet ached with exhaustion, while my mind continued to race. After consuming what small rations I had left, I laid back and digested, while I watched the sun set behind the jagged cliffs far off to the west. I had little remaining in the way of supply. I couldn't survive out here for long. I waited for nightfall and then used flight magic to soar quickly over the desolate borderlands. I flew through the cold, moon-lit sky towards Bishopsgate. I wasn't sure why, or what I expected to find there. I was compelled by Fergus' words, so I hastened my flight that way. I figured I'd inspect the state of things. Then I'd make my way back to Torbana. It seemed inevitable that both Theb and the mighty giant killers would return there eventually, to collect on their fame and fortune for the destruction of the steading to the west. I made my way over the hilly landscape and into the now desolate Sharmal River Valley, which once thrived with human expansion. It was obvious to me that there was something else happening in the Sharmal River Valley than a resurgence of giants. The Drow, from what little I knew, were notorious in their evil intent, but unlikely to conspire with anyone, especially overlanders. They preferred to rule and command, not ally and befriend. They would only be involved if there was truly something to be gained. But what did the West hold that they would covet? How would massive giants allow the Dark Elves to command them? Also, for the giants and orcs to attack, and thereby provoke the humans, and thus inspire them to seek and destroy their homelands, and exterminate their kind, made no sense either. What was their endgame? Something else was happening, and my hunch was that it led right back to Bishopsgate, and the morbid evil of Quell Tabor. I headed there first, to, as Fergus asked, find my people, and perhaps whatever else remained of my lost riches. When I reached the outskirts of Bishopsgate, I could see the town was no longer the one we had enjoyed for so many years. It was far worse than even Theb had told. There was no traffic coming in or going out. The town itself was a carcass. I remained concealed in invisibility as I passed many horrific scenes, which were ever more gruesome the closer I got. Skewered bodies on wooden posts lined the main highway to the bridge gate that once welcomed traders from all over the known world. Beneath their rotting, mangled bodies were words scrawled in blood: "Would not submit," and "Forever dead." As I got closer, I could hear the moaning and wailing of human suffering, almost in concert with the calls of carrion birds and the constant buzz of flies. There was a loud voice towering above them all, shouting at all those within range. I couldn't make much of it out at first, but as I got closer, I gathered it was about how detestable and unworthy they all were.
Cry out for mercy from the great Moscow, for you will not get it. For you are all unworthy. You must submit. Pray for his forgiveness. Pray so that he will not make you forever dead.
There were hundreds of decrepit, starving men, women, and children on their hands and knees, crying before the priest.
You looked to your human masters to provide you with what you thought you needed. The things of this world you crave. Land for food, peace, and security for your families. Look how quickly Moscow can take that all away. You must submit. Only Moscow can feed you. Only he can offer eternal life.
By this time I was certain that any remaining crew of mine were long gone from this place. After an extensive and painstaking search, I learned all remaining drops of treasure I had stashed were already plundered from their hiding spots. No wonder Theb insisted we never return here. Now it was only morbid curiosity that caused me to remain. Strangely, I no longer felt out of place. I was acting with purpose.
You there,
yelled the priest, pointing in my general direction. I dropped to one knee and looked for an escape route when I noticed he was pointing to a woman behind me.
Will you submit? Will you give all of this life and personal possessions away for the protection of the master of life and death, the judge of all things?
Yes, I will submit. I accept my desires, and I desire eternal life,
said the woman. She was then taken through a red drapery to a passage beyond that led to the old hall of the House of Tabor. I followed her to see where she would be taken. She was not led into the hall, but stripped of her clothes and then covered in blood. She and a group of 30 other men and women were then led down a stairway and through a rear passageway out of the town. I followed as they were forced to walk naked, drenched in blood, in the cold autumn evening. They were shivering and gasping for air, staggering like the undead towards the keep we used to call Eleanor. The road was littered with bodies, and the carrion birds, flies, wild dogs, and rats were everywhere about them. They were cackling, buzzing, barking, and scurrying, feeding on the freshest corpses, and growling and nipping at the terrified initiates of submission, who had still managed to stay on their feet. The more cold and tired they became, the more would fall to the side. The guards would whip at them, and if they would not stand up, they would kill them. Their murdered bodies would then be collected and placed on carts, also heading towards Eleanor. Those left behind would be devoured precipitously by the hungry carrion beasts. During the 100-mile march westward, the group had depleted from around 30 submitters to about a dozen when they finally reached what was Eleanor a few days later. I could feel the evil coursing through that small broken keep. The fear and dread were pulsating and rumbling like a volcano about to erupt with dread. There were also many warriors watching the arrival of the new blood-covered submitters. They wore many different types of armor and insignia, and many appeared quite foreign to this area. Their solemn faces bespoke their level of devotion to this awful place. I could also detect quite a bit of powerful magic there as well. I didn't dare approach any further for fear of my own detection. I had confirmed that Quell not only created his own powerful religious cult, but that he was using the captured living slaves for the furious construction of a massive temple just beyond the old keep. It was a stone ziggurat built atop endless piles of rotting human bodies that had been collected and deposited beneath. The putrid smell of death and constant hum of ravenous flies filled the air. It was so rank, I was forced to cover my nose and mouth with a scarf. How these people could become accustomed to this stench astonished me. This smell, coupled with the aura of fear and sickness that this temple created, kept all of Quell's many enemies away. Now I understood why no orc, giant, or any other dissenting humanoid would dare come anywhere near this wretched place. But strangely, I felt dutiful to witness it all, to gather every detail carefully. My own feelings of anxiety and hopelessness had drawn me to this place, to witness this blood temple and all of its obscenities. But now I felt exorcised of all those negative emotions I had carried there. Now that I had seen for myself what was truly happening here, and what Quell and his minions were up to, I felt freed, released, and repulsed. I was now compelled to get as far away from there as quickly as possible. I needed to warn Dan. As famous as he had become, Quell must be aware of his place in the Order, and his ascension of power. Quell hadn't forgotten Dan, and their mutual reckoning for revenge. Quell most certainly wanted Dan dead, or worse. With the ascension of Fergus to High Priest, and his own history of defying Quell's will, the White Flame would most certainly be his next target. As I had suspected, the White Flame had indeed made their way back towards the Three Kingdoms to the south. Their path on the road to Torbana was illuminated by the blessings of the Allfather. Fergus' power had swelled greatly, but unlike Quell's power of fear and dread, it was a power of mercy and benevolence. He healed the sick and helpless, fed the starving masses, and brought joy to all the shattered communities he passed. Fergus could also feel the growing evil that fumed to the southwest. This cloud of darkness he had foreseen, that stomach-churning coldness that had nearly consumed him spiritually, still remained unchecked. The fear Fergus conquered within did not make the danger outside him go away. This evil was still growing, and now it was coming for him. Fergus' new position and axe had gained much attention from his enemies. Fergus had gained tremendous powers of augury. He saw much of what was to be, and what had transpired from an ever higher vantage point, far above the flying range of the greatest eagle, beyond even the clouds. He gained glimpses of eternal time and space. He saw the outer worlds, and this helped him see more clearly what would inevitably come to be on ours. He prayed for heavenly protection from the onslaught that he knew was coming. Dan was increasingly bothered by the way Fergus had sent me away. He understood Thon's point of view. If Dan was a ranger, he would be compelled to capture someone like Theb Karu at the first opportunity. Because I am a thief by trade, the mages naturally found my intentions hidden, whereas to Dan they were as plain as the blue sky. I cared about him, as I had when I rescued him in childhood. I had awoken to come to his aid again. I was not there helping them, or Fergus and his god. That is why the paladins mistrusted me. As the White Flame made their way down the road to Torbana on horseback, Dan approached the new High Priest.
High Priest, might I have a word? Fergus.
He smiled back.
I'd prefer we keep it personal. We're friends always, and comrades first, Dan. What troubles you? It is my friend, the half-elf woman. Why was she sent away? She did so much to help us. She is very useful. Yes, that she is.
Fergus nodded in absolute agreement. Dan was not expecting that answer.
Did something happen between our gods and the god of the elves? Something I missed?
Dan asked innocently.
Yes, something definitely happened. You saw it. A brilliant connection of power through cooperation. A scintillating victory. Then why did you send her? Do you love her, Dan? Love her?
Dan smiled and chuckled with embarrassment.
No, of course not. No, you didn't think that she and I were... She loves you very deeply. She will do anything to protect you. Well, we're friends. We're not lovers, if that's what you mean. Never have been. I'm sworn to the quest,
he said boldly. Though Fergus knew better, Dan was guilty of many discretions. But he spoke the truth about us. I loved him, but we were not lovers.
I've wished for the love of a woman too.
Fergus spouted unabashedly.
But fatherhood is not in my destiny.
He said, smiling.
Or yours.
He said, emphatically.
I can assure you, that's not what I meant. Forget it.
Dan began to wonder why Fergus stated so emphatically that fatherhood was not in his destiny. Was that a portent of his own death? Was it because of me? Or despite me? Dan wondered.
She is on her way here, back from Alinor.
Dan was surprised to hear that town be mentioned at all, especially now.
She will meet us in Torbana and report on the situation there. I sent her away because I saw her soul, like I see yours, and I knew what she would do. The All-Father shows me many things.
Fergus smiled.
Are you saying that was your intention?
Dan was further puzzled.
Dan, if I want to have spies, I can't have spies.
He smiled somewhat mischievously.
I agree. She is worthy of our trust and friendship. If I had sent her there with my blessings, and she had done so of her own free will, she would never have survived the trip. The evil ones would have smelt it on her.
Dan smiled, both surprised and impressed by Fergus' modest guile.
Do they know?
He looked back towards the caravan of his allies. The mages were watching now, clearly curious what their conversation was about.
They will, when they need to.
Fergus smiled. When the White Flame arrived at Tor Bona, the city was on lockdown. With so many refugees approaching so regularly, and no way to feed or provide shelter for them, the Regent Eric was forced to keep all new arrivals outside of the walls. There were thousands of them gathered outside. Shanty villages had formed, and even Fergus's power of distributing human welfare was tapped, trying to keep all of that desperate human need at bay. The castle guard took a more forceful approach, beating the throngs back with the blunt ends of their spears, trying to clear a path to allow the White Flame's caravan to enter the city's gates. The inside of the city wasn't much better. There were huddled families on every street, crying for food and salvation. Every loyal man-at-arms available was needed to protect the king's court from being overwhelmed by the throngs of hungry, angry, and destitute people. The 7 members of the White Flame were led into the king's hall, which was remarkably quiet compared to the stream of misery and begging that howled like the wind outside. As they approached the throne of King Owen, a familiar voice rang out.
Well, if it isn't the mighty giant killers, the White Flame,
spoke Silas boldly,
Master Silas, it is you,
with his large laugh filling the hall. The 7 were all very happy to see an unexpected face who stood beside the troubled king's regent. Fergus motioned to them to slow their approach to greet him, in order to show respect to the throne. But it was not the king that now sat upon it, but his nephew, Eric, who was acting as regent while Owen was away to the east.
Regent, in these times of great troubles, we're pleased to bring good tidings.
The regent's interest was piqued. Good news was very hard to come by.
We've found the giant's base to the northwest. It has been destroyed.
Fergus said with distinction, Surprisingly, Eric remained despondent and looked on the new arrivals with incredulity. He looked to have aged 20 years since the last time Fergus saw him, only a few years earlier. The stress and suffering that prevailed upon his domain he now governed clearly weighed heavily upon him. Being a royal had lost all of its fun and indulgences.
Destroyed, you say? All of them?
He said in disbelief, slumped down in his throne. Fergus approached and prostrated himself with due respect.
Yes, Regent. They had constructed a massive wooden fortress, about 150 miles northwest of the River Luval. They had it built with surprising speed. It was used as a base from which to orchestrate their many attacks east, including those on Ebok and Teton. We found it, and with the aid of some unexpected allies, razed it completely. There were no survivors.
The regent turned to Silas, who smiled back at him with satisfaction.
You remember Fergus, my lord? He has recently been appointed as High Priest of the Order, following the passing of the great Keelan Thiel.
Eric nodded, unimpressed.
We call him the Great Seer. He led this mission. Who were these unexpected allies?
Eric inquired.
Friends of Dan Tenuvial, one of our greatest swordsmen.
The regent's interest was piqued. He sat up as Fergus motioned towards him.
So you are Dan Tenuvial. Your reputation precedes you here. All well, I hope, Sir Eric.
Dan smiled.
Which allies?
Eric questioned, holding back the urge to cough again.
Sir?
Dan was confused.
Who were these allies you were able to secure to undo the mighty giant's fortress?
Eric asked bluntly. Dan looked to Fergus for counsel, but Fergus simply motioned for him to answer.
They were elves, sir. Elves? Elves!
Eric laughed out loud, which then descended into a coughing fit. He cleared his voice and then pointed his finger at Dan.
You, young sir, have many enemies to our west. Out in those borderlands you once called home, they give rise to a new order. Under Quell Tabor, he has created a zealous church state which has broken away and claimed much of our Shama lands. Rather than ally with us against the giant's horde, Quell has created another kingdom of his own, a domain of pure evil. They have harassed and destroyed much of our remaining army and converted many of our people to their blood religion.
He gasped for air before he was consumed in another coughing fit. His attendants gave him a fresh rag to spit into.
Yes, we are aware of this man and his godless blood cult.
Fergus interjected. The regent ignored Fergus. He looked at Dan with a foreboding gaze.
Many of Torbana's greatest warriors were also enticed to join his cause. They left with your High Lord to put down his movement. Then they returned as servants of Quell, rallying others to join them out west.
Fergus looked to Silas, for they both knew where this blistering expose was going next, and they had yet to brief the other members.
They have made demands on your life, young Tenuvial. On all of you.
He said, waving his finger wildly at the 8 members of the Sacred Fire.
They say we all stand to be condemned to a gruesome death by simply allowing you here in my court. They don't like you at all. We will deal with Quell Tavor soon enough,
Dan replied with confidence. As disappointed as Dan was with the petulant regent, he was now more eager than ever to exact the vengeance his god had promised. The silent rage growing inside him pulsated through his veins. He was eager to see justice dealt by his own hand unto these many enemies the regent warned him of.
and the great Gal GLaDOS of Einderhall, your very own former High Lord. Will you, Tanuvio, deal with him as well?
He asked, coughing up phlegm and blood after he spoke. Dan looked to Silas, puzzled.
Gal GLaDOS, you lie! That cannot be true!
Shouted Kiantan. Silas motioned for silence. The outrage of the warriors could now hardly be contained. The last thing they were expecting this day was to be taunted and disrespected in this way. Silas demanded their attention.
Our High Lord Gal GLaDOS, it appears, has sided with Quell. What? No, that cannot be. We've lost all powers of communion with him. He may be under the influence of arcane suggestion. There is still hope for his redemption. But he has already taken up arms against our brothers and believe he has slain your former leader, the Ranger Lord, Reese, and the priest Bertal.
The High Priest and High Mage were aware, but the other 6 were now lost in bewilderment.
Great Seer, how could this escape your view?
Exclaimed Reggie to his High Priest Fergus.
It has not!
Fergus' voice rang out with great power, much louder than any of his comrades had ever heard. His stern tone silenced his paladins.
I have seen this. I have felt this. This rising pool of darkness, an abyss with no end, for many months before today.
Fergus stood over the White Flame members with confidence and power that beamed through him like sunlight.
I have seen with my own eyes.
He said, pacing before the powerful men.
I have seen through borrowed eyes.
He said as he looked at Dan.
Through the eyes of friends.
He said, meeting Silas's eyes.
And through the blessings of the All-Father. Have faith, my brothers, for that is what this battle against the faithless will require most. This is the darkness we were destined to face, and where we must bring the All-Father's light. This is the battle we have prepared for our whole lives. It is now before us. Are you ready?
He asked his brave following. Their answer was obvious, their bewilderment removed. The mighty White Flame came together. They were agreed that they were not only ready, but once again rededicated to the principle that a moment such as this was their God-given life's purpose on this plane. All members of the group had grown in power greatly over the last few years. Fergus Glow had given them a new confidence, and his words a clearer purpose than yet experienced.
Well,
Coughed Eric, clapping his hands sarcastically.
I'll pray you find victory. But I can assure you, you'll need more than my prayers, and 8 men to do it.
The newly minted confidence of the Flame was tested at once. They were unsure what he meant by them being alone in this fight.
And you must leave here. At once. Your presence here threatens the monarchy and this city's safety.
He said dismissively, as his nerve finally consumed him.
I have not a man to spare you, and cannot offer you safe harbor here. I certainly cannot afford a war with Queltavor now. My uncle, the king, has repositioned himself to the east to gain the support of his brothers and to find the allies. My messengers no longer return. The three kingdoms are on the brink of collapse.
What more reason need you have, Eric, than to stand with us now, against this evil?
Asked Silas.
You do not want your legacy as regent to be based on fear and shame? We've accomplished your king's quest. We have not asked for any reward. Can't you show more respect than this?
Demanded the mighty Kiontan.
Enough!
Blurted the sickly regent. He coughed wildly again and pointed his stubby finger towards the hulking paladin.
I rule here now. Not you or your order. You may stay just this one night here in my castle, but I expect you to be gone in the morning.
The 8 men of the order were stunned that the regent Eric could be so bold as to cast them aside this way. Eric was sickly and very afraid. He got up from his throne, coughing again into a blood-soaked towel. He looked away as he led his retinue of useless nurses and confidants in his wake.
Gods, see these men out!
Of course, as scared as he was of Quell, Eric would have more trouble than he could handle by taking either side of this confrontation. His guards were prompt but respectful, as they led the High Mage Silas and the White Flame's 7-member party to private assigned quarters deep in the tower's keep. Eric instructed the local magistrate that he did not want anyone else seeing them, and that they were to be escorted off the king's grounds by noon tomorrow. What he might do if they refused to leave was anyone's guess. A victory parade, as they might have expected, was out of the question. After a modest and uncelebratory dinner that they prepared for themselves, in a very humble setting, the members of the Order of the Sacred Fire discussed their next move. With Galglados now allied with Quell, the Order was once again without a High Lord. After 8 years without a single change in leadership, this was now the second change of the Triumvirate in under a year. Fergus had elevated to the challenge as High Priest, but there were few consensus military leaders who had the leadership and training skill of Galglados. There was only one clear candidate, and he was now thousands of miles away to the east. After dinner, the High Mage and the newly appointed High Priest discussed their situation privately as a 2-part triumvirate. After achieving a heightened state of meditation, they communed with the spirits of the living and the dead.
I am in contact with Ramthar,
said Silas to Fergus.
I have seen him,
replied the Great Seer.
He is coming. He is not alone.
Silas agreed.
He brings great power with him. His armies will be focused, organized, unlike the scattered chaos of the Horde.
Fergus could see the face of Quell, the focal point of all the darkness that swelled to the west under the Moscal banner. It was then that Fergus' sight grew even higher, and his consciousness ascended. Fergus' mind was elevated by the hand of the All-Father himself, and his senses lifted to a viewpoint far above the clouds. The All-Father moved his hand from one side to another, and the clouds cleared, revealing the landscape of the northern lands, Fergus' ancestral homeland. From on high, he could see an approaching army, a new horde, this time backed by blistering cold and snow. It was an invasion of frost giants. They were lumbering towards the Castle Voss, and there was no army to stop them. Another wave of giant raiders, nearly twice the size of the hill giants, was on its way there. Then he was shown a desolate mountain range far to the southwest, where a great cauldron of fire burned. It was the forge within the mountain, the fire giant hall, called Tifetin. The fire giant smithies hammered away, manufacturing new weapons and armor for the coming war. Tifetin was no longer just a legend. It was real and was the center of the giants' movement. It was the seat of power from which all the giants came. Fergus descended down to his body and breathed in deeply.
What have you seen?
Asked Silas.
A horde of giants approaches from the north. They are coming for Castle Voss. How?
There were far too many questions to ask to await an answer, so Silas sprang into action.
We do not have much time. I must return there at once and lead the defense. You must remain south, find allies, and see that Quell is dealt with. I understand, and it shall be done.
Fergus agreed. With that, the High Mage Silas gathered some things hastily and teleported himself back to Castle Voss, the home of the sacred fire. The strange thing about augury, or the power of premonition, or future vision, is the limits of the human mind. For even if you could see all of what Fergus was shown, unlike his All-Father, Fergus could not see the endless myriad containing all counter-perspectives, the actions behind the actions you've seen. Fergus could not see all actions happening at once. While looking from on high, he could not see what dangers lay right before him, as his purvey was extended skyward and the coming danger was afoot. But Fergus was very wise, and chose to employ me, without my even knowing it, for I was already on my way back to Torbana to warn Dan and his friends. Quell was coming, but not just with his dark army of converts. He had also dispatched the largest and most deadly assassins guild I had ever seen converge in one place. I learned from trusted informants that the assassins had already been led into the city of Torbana by Eric and his guard, days before the White Flame arrived. But Fergus, in his wisdom, had enabled me to be two of those extra eyes for him. For if I had even a whiff of a do-gooder smell on me, I could never have made my way through the evil keep at Alinor undetected. It was a clever deception for a pious priest of truth. I'll give him that. I flew up to the high tower of Torbana invisibly and made my way down from there. As I descended, I overheard the guards discussing the location of Fergus' men in greater detail. I realized they had been purposefully deposited in quarters that had no means for escape. There was only one way in and one way out. There was one long hallway with a spiral staircase, both with locked iron gates, which led to the 3 rooms where they slept. In my haste to reach Dan and warn him, I fell foolishly into a trap laid by the ranger Thon. A thin black twine snare had been set along the stone floor, preventing any unwanted intruders from passing undetected. Had I been looking and not racing towards the door in desperation, I would have spotted it easily. But as fate would have it, and just as Theb had warned, my emotions entrapped me again, and I was now ensnared. I felt so foolish. The ranger closed in like a spider with a bug caught on its web. My invisibility was lost when he tackled me to the ground. He drew his sword to my neck.
You?
Thon had been shocked by the news of so much treachery. My presence seemed only a natural part of the growing conspiracy all around them. Ranger, stop. I am here to warn you. They are coming.
Who is coming?
Before I could answer, we both heard the unlatching of the iron gate above. Then the soft patter of feet along the spiral steel staircase. Thon stepped up to get a better view, but then retreated quickly towards the door of the quarters. He tapped gently with a prescribed pattern on each door, alerting his comrades that they had been set up. Thon did not like where they had been stationed, and had advised they all leave the city that night. He was certain now that Eric had been compromised. The first wave of killers whisked past me as I remained partially ensnared, and huddled into a shadowy crevasse between the wall and the stone floor. About a dozen heavily armed assassins took up positions beside the 3 doors. Then another trio approached, carrying 3 firebombs, 1 for each room, which were already lit. I managed to escape the rope trap that Thon sprung, just in time to trip a fire carrier assassin as he passed me. He fell to the floor, losing control of the incendiary. Thon and I both leapt away instinctively towards the staircase as the entire hallway burst into flames. The assassins outside the doors were all engulfed in fire and bellowed horribly. The doors to the rooms opened soon thereafter. Khan was among the first out and used a whirlwind spell to thrust the fire, smoke, and burning bodies of the would-be killers into the air and up the shaft of the spiral staircase. The force of the wind and fire burst through the top of the tower as Thon and I clung to the iron staircase. But then the second wave came. These were no paid swords. Some were from the Carbletooth clan of Vedun. They were professionals, well-trained and very determined to succeed. As they approached, Thon and I formed a perimeter at the bottom of the stairs. Knowing their surprise was lost, they resorted to using missiles. They threw knives and fired blow darts and crossbow bolts at us. Thon then charged up the stairs with his shield before him, threw the volley of missiles and managed to close in on the crossbowman. He swatted his crossbow back into his face. Then he slashed his body with his sword while flinging him down the stairs. Several others closed in on him, thrusting knives and short swords from every direction. Remarkably, the ranger evaded every attack and parried the thugs back. Then what seemed like a boulder smashed through the group of killers. It was Kiartan, his shield swatting back the much smaller men easily. Reggie followed right behind him, parrying and dropping the lesser fighters with relative ease. The hall was still filled with black smoke, and every combatant was attempting to make their way to better air. This helped us force our way through the staircase towards the main hall. After losing many of their best men to the swords of the ranger and paladins, the rest of the assassin squad retreated. As they did, they swung closed the last iron gate that led to the main hall. Then they tossed smoke grenades through the metal bars in a last-ditch attempt to suffocate us. The noxious smoke filled the darkened hall. The iron gate was locked. I reached for the pick in my toolkit. But then, mighty Kiartan ran forward with his shield before him, smashing through the metal gate. If I didn't actually see it happen, I would not have believed it possible. I was thoroughly impressed. This man was incredibly strong. The entire metal frame of the gate was thrown from the brick wall that held it. Kiartan's innate strength was akin to Dan's beauty. Something so immeasurable, it could only have been gifted by their gods. By the time we made our way to the Regent's Hall, most of the castle guards were already dead. Those that remained were looking to us for mercy and guidance. The entire inner keep was now ablaze. The people within the city were rioting. The Regent himself was nowhere to be found. We took stock of our own and found only Dan was missing. I'll get him. I volunteered to re-enter the smoke-filled stairway.
No.
Fergus stopped me.
He is outside. We must hurry.
That night, after all the tragic news and their less than formal dinner, Dan turned in early and dreamt deeply and profoundly. It was his first glimpse of what would later be known as the shared vision. In the dream, he was confronted by a one-eyed mountain dwarf. The dwarf explained he had escaped slavery at the hands of the giants. He claimed he could lead Dan through a secret passage underneath a mountain stronghold. Dan then dreamt he fell into the web of a giant spider. He was unable to move. It was with that feeling of paralysis that Dan awoke. His heart was racing. It was late, but he was so shaken by this dream that he needed to get up and move. After Dan got dressed and adequately armed for the street, he made his way past Thon, who urged him to stay. But Dan used his remarkable powers of persuasion to allow himself past his friend and overseer, past the tower guards, and all the way down to the only remaining tavern open on the grounds, the Grey Griffin. It was the only place for entertainment in town. It was very crowded that night, as the streets were already rife with violence. Among those wealthy and influential enough to get inside the Grey Griffin and away from the street rabble was Theb, who had tracked me here since Bishop. Where else would the cloak go? But he did not expect to see Dan here, drinking incessantly. When Theb saw Dan look his way, he hid his face. Theb recognized about 7 different cutthroats enter after Dan had. They included Steeljaw and Mayerswain. Both were true professionals and did not work together often. Theb observed them. They were watching Dan closely. Theb knew there would be trouble. The entertainment grew as the night wore on. Outside the tavern, the streets grew even rowdier. But inside, the drinks Dan had downed led to even more he ordered. The attention Dan drew was dangerous and typical. Theb had watched Dan's back for years. He had not changed a bit.
I shall make a toast to our hero, our man of the people, the giant killer, Dan Tenuvial,
said the clever Mayerswain. The bar erupted in agreement.
We never see any of the other great lords here in bars like the Grey Griffin. No, they are too good for us. But Dan, he is a man like us.
The charismatic rogue fired up the bar further. Dan looked on with suspicious admiration.
It is a pity, though, we've heard so many tales, but none of us have ever seen him actually fight.
The bar was silenced.
Now, take my excellent friend Steeljaw. Now, here's a real fighting man.
The crowd cheered. Steeljaw was a man of near Kiantan's size, a gargantuan body, covered in scars. He had been fighting his whole life.
Too bad a great lord like Dan could never handle a true fighter like Steeljaw.
The crowd roared and already money started to trade hands as bets were made.
That's something you pray you will never have to see,
boasted Dan, smiling off the entire notion of the rogue's promotion. Steeljaw let out a roar which silenced the bar. He approached Dan's place at the corner of the bar, grabbing and throwing a table and all of its contents from one side of the tavern to the other. He pointed at Dan's face and said,
I am Steeljaw. No man or beast can defeat me hand to hand in any tavern. I have the strength of 3 men. No man's fist can drop me.
Dan looked at him sternly.
Steeljaw, do yourself a favor. Don't. I will have to defend myself, and that wouldn't be good for you. I'm here for drinks and to relax. Come, let me buy you something.
He smiled. It almost seemed that Dan's amazing powers of persuasion had evaded the inevitable, but the hulking brawler wanted to fight. He pounded his fist on the bar before Dan, and then got up right in his face. Dan's years of street brawling taught him there was no turning back. A fight was now necessary to save face. He whisked off the bar stool and then took a modest defensive crouch. Steeljaw pursued. Before the bar crowd could truly get excited about the fight actually happening, Steeljaw's fist was grabbed and turned in. Dan then pulled his arm downward, spinning into him, while forcing his head into the cold floor with his foot. Dan turned the arm of his attacker, and in so doing, he used a little anger, along with his giant strength, tearing the massive muscles of his attacker's shoulder. Steeljaw cried out in agony. The bar went silent. That's when Mayerswain made his move. With Dan's back exposed, he closed in with his dagger. Theb jumped in unexpectedly from the other side and parried the knife, forcing the young assassin back.
The cloak? What are you?
Mayerswain was nearly as baffled as Dan was by Theb's sudden appearance. Theb turned to Dan and spoke one word. Assassins. Dan spun and whirled Steeljaw by his shredded arm and threw his heavy, dangling body into a couple of sword-wielding thugs who approached from behind. Theb was keen not to let anyone speaking even an alias of his name leave this bar alive. This young assassin's career would have to end today. Theb pulled out a second sword and after a brief incantation, leapt up and then flew above him, swiping down with multiple shots until Mayerswain's defensive focus was completely above his head. That's when Theb swooped down behind him, rolled and turned quickly, thrusting his broadsword through the young killer's abdomen. Dan had taken a few knives and throwing stars to the legs and butt, but was so enraged and intoxicated that he couldn't even feel the wounds. He closed in furiously and struck two of the thugs down with his fists in a matter of seconds. Their feeble-looking attempts at defense were proof to all as to the true power of Dan's fighting skill. With their leader dead and many of the others dying or wounded, the remainder of the gang fled the bar. Dan pursued angrily. Before he reached the only available exit, he stopped and noticed Theb above the moaning Steeljaw, broadsword to neck. The broken strong man begged the cloak for mercy, knowing there would be none. Theb finished him and then turned to Dan with two slim gray fingers raised. That is twice I've saved you. I still don't know why, he said with a snarky elvish accent. Dan then blasted through the doors of the bar and rolled onto the street and found the rest of the fleeing assassins were already lost amid an outbreak of total anarchy in the streets. The starving, homeless populace was now in full revolt. There were angry people everywhere, breaking down doors, demanding food. The village guard was nowhere to be found. Rain started to pour down harder as Dan made his way to the middle of the street, fending off a few rioters running past. Theb was no longer visible behind him. As Dan stepped purposefully closer towards the town center, he saw a gathering of angry villagers. They were yelling and taunting someone. Two horses backed up, hoisting Eric, the regent of Torbana, by the arms over a wooden beam. Before the blood cough could take him, he was thoroughly tortured and now strung up to die. The angry crowd cheered. Dan approached slowly. There was a Moscow priest among them, chanting and converting ever more followers within this orgy of violence.
Put him down,
Dan demanded. At first, no one took notice, but he took a few more steps and yelled out again.
Put him down.
The priest turned and pointed to Dan.
You there. You must submit. You are not the one creating order here. It is the true bringer of peace, our high priest. You must submit. Moscow demands it.
I will not. I will never submit to Quell, his dark demon, or any of you blood-drinking heathens.
The priest was stunned by Dan's powerful voice, filled with a warrior's rage. Dan continued his brisk steps towards him. The cowering priest took a few steps back and motioned to a horseman behind him.
Then you will die.
Several of the bloodthirsty converts hissed at Dan and repeated the priest's warning. They taunted and cackled at him, but moved back and aside as he came closer. Dan was then shocked, for here before him, holding aloft the bloodied body of the regent of Torbana by a rope, was his master, his friend, and mentor, Galglados. It was his full plate armor and insignia anyway. Dan was still not convinced it was truly him. As Galglados approached, Dan yelled out to him.
High Lord, if that is truly you, show yourself.
Dan demanded, now drenched in the cold winter rain. Yet Dan's body was warmed like summer by the exhilarating and euphoric energy of combat that swelled through his body. He felt no fear or pain, only a full-body orgasm of bloodlust, fueled by his unrequited revenge. Galglados removed his helmet. His face was covered in paint. His eyes looked past Dan like he was dead already. The priest came closer, his blood-covered hand extended into Dan's face.
You must submit. All will submit. The time has come. Moscow is here.
Dan swatted the priest's hand away from his face. That prompted several of the horsemen, including Galglados, to encircle him. They were all fully armored, and their powerful steeds were among the best breeds in these lands. Dan was woefully outmatched, but his anger made him fearless. He pulled out the short sword he brought along, just in case. Then a bright light formed above the horseman's head. It was a massive hand the size of a man, illuminated with white light. The godly hand, wielded by Fergus, thrust forward with unstoppable force and knocked many of the dark horsemen back. Then it struck the Moscow priest squarely in the face. Then the godly hand knocked the regent free, and his lifeless body fell to the ground. While Fergus slapped his enemies down with the hand of the Allfather, Galglados' spooked horse whinnied and lifted up onto its hind legs. Dan took the opportunity to charge and strike low at its back hoof, hacking it off with his blunt short sword, using the force of his giant strength. The horse bellowed in pain and fell. Galglados and all of his heavy armor fell with it and crashed into the cold mud. Dan took the initiative and leapt on top of him, but Galglados was very quick. He managed to peel from Dan's grasp and flung him aside. His long sword made parrying extremely difficult, and Dan had taken several quick shots to his naked arms as he tried to close and grapple. Dan was at a major disadvantage, but continued to attack anyway. Galglados blocked the attack and struck Dan's poorly armored body with 2 more shots to the wrist and waist. Rather than fall back, Dan pursued and closed in again in an attempt to grapple him down and use his superior strength to overwhelm him. But once again, the former High Lord evaded his grasp and turned and slashed him in the back. Dan was badly hurt. Galglados was clearly an agent of evil, but still an honorable fighter. He allowed Dan to remain down without finishing him. He took perfect position and awaited his next move. Dan looked up into his eyes, writhing in pain.
Why?
He grunted, and then asked again even louder.
Why?
But the former High Lord did not speak. He simply looked down with anticipation of further battle, which the bloody Dan gathered himself to bring. That's when Keontan and Reg came in. Though fully armored, they did not fare much better. Galglados had fended off both paladins' forceful attacks and found their weak points masterfully, dropping each after only a few rounds of melee. It was clear that despite their many achievements and bravery, none of the White Flame were anywhere near the level of swordsmen as their former master. But the White Flame did have one advantage this night, and that was in magic users. When confronted by our spellcasters, Galglados and his riders were held at bay by a wall of force created by Khan. Fergus and Thon gathered the paladins, and I helped Dan up, and we all retreated. We later learned that Quell's 2 wizards were on another mission, which is how we managed to escape alive. But those wizards, former Blue Flame member Ozymandias and his new apprentice Ageos, were not in Torbana at that moment because they awaited Silas at Castle Vas. Silas teleported into his inner sanctum deep within the walls of Castle Vas. When coupled with the magic of the world's greatest wizards, priests, and warriors of the time, Castle Vas was thought to be impregnable. But Ozymandias, Silas's former student, knew all of its secrets, including the way in, and had made himself at home in his former High Mage sanctum.
Found? what you were looking for?
Spoke Silas forcefully. Ozymandias put the scrolls down he appeared to be collecting.
Master Silas, you've returned. What news from the south?
Silas strode purposefully toward his former student, anger filling his eyes. He began an incantation. Moments later, Ozymandias was held aloft on the wall by Silas's powerful magic.
Where have you been?
Asked Silas with uncommon anger.
Master Silas, what is the meaning of this? I don't understand,
said Ozymandias desperately.
You have not responded to our calls. You have not explained your absence during this time of hardship. You were not here for Thiel's burial. And now you arrive in my laboratory unannounced, like a common thief.
His anger swelled. Silas's disappointment with his treasured protege distracted him from the danger that approached from behind. Ozymandias added to his distraction with an appeal for restraint.
Master Silas, please. I was investigating. I've learned much. I needed to remain silent.
Silas focused his magic and his anger on the hold spell, pinning Ozymandias' arms and legs to the wall, and then forcing them apart, almost quartering him. But, by design, as his attention was squarely on his protege, the real plotter of this attack made his move. Aegeus was an assassin of advanced skill, and like Theb, he also used magic to aid in the efficacy of his hits. He lurched from the shadows silently and drove his sword into Silas's back. It was a devastating blow, but neither Aegeus or the freed Ozymandias was taking any chances. Now freed, Ozzy hurled a volley of magic missiles into his archmage's chest, and before he could recover, Aegeus then grasped Silas by his head and thrust his dagger into the back of Silas's neck.
Be silent, old man. Your days of chanting magic are over.
The bloody dagger pierced through his head and jutted out from his mouth. Silas fell to the ground in silent disbelief, his eyes transfixed on his former apprentice until they were closed forevermore. The two villains then raided the laboratory of magic items, gathering all the powerful scrolls and potions they could find and carry. Then they burned Silas's body and set fire to the sanctum. Before they executed the hit on the High Mage, the two traitors had laid several traps and committed many dastardly acts of sabotage throughout the castle. After making their escape from the castle, they led a raiding party of over 60 frost giants to the castle gates. The startled guardsmen of the gatehouse were unable to arm their defenses. The ballista, longbows, and all of the arrows and bolts in the storehouses had been destroyed. Ozzy warped the stockpile of wooden missiles magically, rendering them useless. The frost giants were massive, some standing over 20 feet tall. They had skin that was blue like ice, and they were well armed and armored. They had traveled far from the northern wastelands. They were able to reach Voss and escape detection with the aid of the two wizards that had turned to evil and shown them the way. The first to reach the gate flung a massive rock at the gatehouse, where the alarm horn blew. The tower was smashed by the impact of the boulder. The gatehouse guards then flung their warped spears at him to no avail. Another frost giant followed behind, turned his hips, and kicked at the iron gate. It did not give way, so he kicked it again, and again, ever more ferociously, as he grew angrier at his unwillingness to give. A third giant reached up to the Barbican with both arms and attempted to pull it down. As the very rock was becoming unset by the force of the giant's bear hug, one of the guards tossed a pail of oil on the frost giant's head, while another flung his lit torch. The giant screamed in agony as half of his head was engulfed in flames. His gray hair and beard crackled as it burned, but rather than flee, the enraged giant swung his massive battle axe at the Barbican, smashing it to pieces. His enraged comrade finally managed to kick the gate open. Another forced his way through the remainder of the rock gatehouse, shattering it, and the guards fled in panic. The giants made their way through the city, destroying every building and killing every human in sight. Only Seshona, the elvish mage and cousin to Nuna, was still alive and present to provide a magic defense. Harmon was the only powerful cleric present. He led a handful of newer fighters and paladins in a desperate counterattack. They fought bravely, but none of those heroes were acquainted with the tactics involved in combating giants. Within a few hours, the defense was lost, and all the members of the Sacred Fire that were present were slain. The Frost Giants knew exactly where to strike, making their way to the ancestral forge, the hearth of Etseve, where many of the greatest weapons of the age were struck. There were many targets there marked for destruction. The forge table, the massive fire pot, the tuyere, which led its draft to the great stack, the vaulted stone chimney constructed by the dwarves centuries ago with the greatest granite and quartzite of the mountains. The legendary Anvil of Ulgar was also ordered destroyed, as was the master smithy himself, Adam of Mountain Glow. Adam was both human and dwarvish by ancestry, having lived through 3 human wives. He was acclaimed throughout the known world for having created the Order's great weapons and powerful custom-fitted armor for well over a century. Adam secreted his family, including his many children, through a secret passage beneath the stairs. He ordered them to flee along with his apprentices. Before his 3rd wife could demand that he join her, the outer walls of the forge collapsed under the pounding of the Frost Giant's mighty steel weapons.
Go, now.
He commanded as the giants closed in, tearing a hole in the walls of the forge. Some of Adam's senior fellows chose to stand beside him to defend the great forge to the last. Adam had left a long spear in the burning coke. Its tip was red and glowing. As the first intruder tore his way through the stone walls and entered the forge, Adam charged at him and thrust the fire-tipped spear into the giant's belly. The frost giant bellowed at the scorching blow, falling back and out of sight. Adam then grabbed his trusty battle axe as more angry frost giants forced their way inside his workplace and shrine. The smithies fought bravely, but the giants were just too powerful. As one of his fellows was pinned beneath the giant's foot, Adam hacked off the giant's toe to free him. Just then another giant grasped Adam by his head, crushing his skull like a grape. Then the giant flung the lifeless body of the great smithy, along with the rest of his fellows, into the hearth, their bodies engulfed in the blazing hot fire. The anvil was then picked up and thrown in as well. Once its shape had melted out of recognition, the giants thrashed and disfigured the rest of the shop's tools, and then toppled the ancient, venerable stack. The frost giants had wrecked the forge and left no other buildings untouched. The All-Gods Church was razed as the desperate worshippers were slaughtered within. After the well-planned attack was finished, the frost giants collected their spoils of war, gold, including some ancient religious artifacts, livestock, and many humanoid slaves. The bodies of the slain members of the Sacred Fire were also collected, just as they had been instructed to do. The giants then moved on and trashed Edgehurst, Torma, Bowl, Tull, and many other little keeps and villages along their path. The greatest of fighters did what they could to stop the onslaught, but their armies were always surprised, and because they were separated from each other, they were unable to form a cohesive defense. In addition to their home castle and the prized ancient weapons forge, the Order of the Sacred Fire had now also lost another irreplaceable leader. Over the next few days, rather than return to the broken castle, we concealed ourselves while we healed and planned. Fergus retreated to prayer, focusing his power of sight to determine the best path forward.